Hi there. Sorry I wasn't able to come to Ruskin this evening. It was a real shame, but I just couldn't make it. So Ian's asked me if I could just send you a video message about community organising and the work that I've been doing over the last 14 years or so. So I just want to say a little bit about, to try and answer the question, does community organising present trade unions with a way of rebuilding the union movement? But before that, a little bit about myself. Over the last 14 years or so, my research has focused on trade union organising in general, but more specifically centred on the way that trade unions have engaged with underrepresented groups in the workforce. My PhD was funded by the TUC and looked at different organising approaches. And my case studies were with three trade unions, looking at the way that they were organising black and minority ethnic workers, the majority of whom were recent migrants to the UK. And one of the unions that I worked closely with was the GMB and two Asian organisers in particular. And I was quite taken with their approach to organising, which was fairly unique in that it allowed for an understanding of the way in which community spaces and cultural norms were used to reach out to workers who had little contact with the union movement. And it was this that led to my growing interest in community-based organising as an approach that have considerable potential for the union movement. So for the last 14 years, I've spent a lot of time interviewing community organisers, looking at the way that their approach to organising differs from that of trade unions, and what this approach might mean if adopted by trade unions, and also doing quite a lot of writing about it. But why the focus in this particular direction? I think it was because I felt that the focus on workers, just as workers, undifferentiated and without any attention as to how their home lives and work lives intersected, was perhaps there was something missing in the debates and in the literature. And this led me into a rethinking about how trade unions have been theorised, what unions were about, what we were organising for. And so this took me back to arguments about class and the debates around the primacy of class in practical left politics, and the general economistic approach to trade unionism, whereby trade unions care mainly about their members' wages and employment in particular sectors, as opposed to seeing themselves as broad social movements. And I've covered this in the Economic and Industrial Democracy paper, which I've written recently. And Richard Hyman, I'm sure lots of you will have come across his work, has written about how trade unions have often treated political action as very subsidiary to their main preoccupation with collective bargaining, which is something that I would agree with. Although given the decline in collective bargaining coverage, I would also say that preoccupation today is much more in terms of individual representation, and that large parts of the union movement have lost the ability to engage in collective bargaining. And I'm not really sure how much activity within unions is actually taken up by collective bargaining today. But anyway, my point here is that it was this thinking about how trade unions are currently constituted, what they purport to do compared to what they actually do, and how their cultures and structures affect what they're able to do. And I was going back to Richard Hyman's work, and in his book on European trade unionism between market class and society, that I picked up on some of the questions he had when he said, how far are trade union inherited traditions or assumption a resource, and to what extent are they a constraint? To what extent can trade union movements escape from their past and redefine their purpose and identity? And I think this is a really important question in relation to where trade unions are at the moment and how they thought about reinvigorating, revitalising over the last 20, 30 years. So can unions shape their future is the question that Hyman was asking, or are structural and cultural constraints too embedded to allow effective rethinking of union purpose for the changed labour market that we have at the moment. So it was this rethinking of union purpose then that I was interested in when I was researching union approaches to organising migrant workers. And it was when I was doing this work in 2001 that I became interested in the work of the East London Communities Organisation, later Telco, later London Citizens, and now Citizens UK. And what interested me was how this community coalition was able to intervene in the employment relationship between unionised and non-unionised workers to increase wages through the Living Wage campaign and improve their terms and conditions of employment. And while other actors in the employment relationship has received quite a bit of attention in academic literature, the relationship between unions and community organisations as these other actors has been less so, particularly in the UK. So I started to take a look at what was going on, first with London Citizens, around the Living Wage campaign. I spent time with the organisation and looking at the tensions between trade unions and London Citizens, and I've written about that in the book on community unionism with Joe McBride and Ian Greenwood, that edited edition. Then I began to wonder whether the difficult relationship that I'd encountered in the UK was replicated elsewhere, and I got an ESRC grant to look at broad-based community coalitions, comparing what was happening in Australia and the US and the UK as well. And you'll have read about that, or you may have seen some writings that I've done on that in the report that I think Ian may have given you. And this led me on then to look at individual approaches to community-based organising, where I started to follow a number of unions here in the UK, interviewing staff about various strategic approaches they were adopting. And I've written more about this in a paper last year in Economic and Industrial Democracy, and I can always send you the details of those if you're interested. And most recently I've written an article in the British Journal of Industrial Relations at the moment, writing about community coalitions and the Sydney trade unions. So this is what I've been doing over the last couple of years, and what I want to do now is just to consider whether or not community-based organising offers trade unions a way of rebuilding the union movement, and if so, what it means for unions and the way that they currently operate. As is often the case in any form of community organising, likelihood is it involves working with or alongside organisations generally considered to be outside of the employment relationship. Like I said, we've seen a growing body of literature and discussion around the role of other actors in the employment relationship. So you may have come across the work of Ed Heery and colleagues who've written about the growing intervention of civil society organisations in employment issues, like Stonewall, for example, who campaign on behalf of lesbian, gays, transsexuals, transgender people, or Age Concern, on behalf of older people. So what am I arguing then? What am I arguing about trade unions and community organising? Firstly, I would say that I'm not arguing that trade union organising in the community is something new. It's a new phenomenon, no. The history of trade union formation is inextricably linked to the places and spaces in which people live and work. But I would argue that the strong links between trade union consciousness and community consciousness have been severely weakened and in most places no longer exist. And we can see this through the demise of trades councils, for example. But also the attack on trade unions, particularly through the Thatcher governments, when this occurred, unions became much more inward-looking, more focused on servicing their members, and unions became less visible in the wider community overall. So there's been a considerable debate over the future of trade unions and trade union decline and the levels of power that trade unions have, and whether trade unions have actually the ability to transform themselves into organisations that are able to respond to the current social, political and economic climate. There's a massive literature on community organising, on union organising in the US and the UK and Australia, where all the federations have established training programmes in organising approaches. And while there's been some success in bringing in some new members and organisation of specific workplaces, it's also been recognised, I think, throughout those countries that progress hasn't been as strong as was hoped. And now, 3 decades later, after the shift to that form of organising, there's a sense, from what I've gathered from the literature and the observations and my own research, is that there's another turn on the way. And the argument that I make in the EDI paper is that unions are starting to rethink their purpose. And while the focus currently is still on servicing and industrial concerns and those general class-related issues, there's a sense that the broader social and political messages, ones that go beyond worker self-interest, are needed to reassert the importance of unions, and part of this involves external solidarity with wider communities beyond the workplace. But I don't want to exaggerate that, the extent to which unions are engaging in community organising. But there's been a number of developments suggesting that unions are taking a greater interest in how community organising might help to reach out to different groups of workers and the general public who perhaps have a negative view of unions. And I think the turn to organising is motivated by, in the UK, should I say, 3 things. The success of community organising as practised by London citizens and its high-profile campaign for the living wage. I don't need to say any more about that because you've got someone there who's going to talk to you about that shortly, if not already done so. But local politicians noticing how, that type of community organising is able to mobilise local people around community activity. And I think London citizens can be credited with this, the instigation of a wider debate on developments around community organising in the UK. And the fact that political parties and unions, seeing and observing what has been going on over the years, are waking up to the potential for growth within their own organisations. Just want to say a little bit, because I haven't got much time, to cover some of the theorisation around community unionism. I just want to highlight some of the key current issues and briefly look at where some of the arguments originate from. But there's more in some of the papers I've written if you're interested. I would say that the source of today's debates on community unionism can be traced back to the 1960s, and in particular C. Wright Mills, well-known sociologist, who wrote a letter to the New Left. And in this letter and this paper, he criticises the left who cling to Labour or the working class as the agent of change. So he says that such a Labour metaphysic, I think, is from the Victorian era, Victorian Marxism, that's now quite unrealistic. Of course, we can't write off the working class, we must study that and freshly, but and of course where Labour is an agency, we must work with it, but we mustn't treat it as the necessary lever. So what he's arguing is that this focus on class, which of course I would argue is vitally important, but taking an economistic approach where the focus is just on class and not other issues of identity and people's the things that make the levels of oppression that make up who people are and what people experience in society need to be incorporated as well. So the debate starts from began and has continued around the debate around class and the extent to which working class consciousness and activity is the primary agent of change, and where class is the political ideology around which to collectivise. So that's where the debates start from, and I think that those debates are actually still quite important, particularly within the union movement. And then building on from that, we have James O'Connor in his paper on a theory towards community unionism saying the only baffling problem we have with which community unions will have to contend is the problem of tactics. And he argues that there's no political weapon easily available which can replicate the industrial strike. Now, of course, we'd all love to be back in the 1970s when unions were particularly strong and where industrial strike had an impact and it was able to change workers' terms and conditions. But currently we're not in that perspective. And of course, we've seen other organisations throughout the world organising around issues which are not necessarily industrial action, which have created substantial change. So although this was written a long time ago, in a sense it shows some lack of imagination from where we are today. There was also big debates around whether and who should be the agents of change in society. Some people thought that, well, poor people could be great agents of change because they've not necessarily been successfully integrated in the system, and because they're poor they felt greater grievances and marginalisation from society. So then focusing on poor meant inevitably shifting attention from the sphere of work to the community where the poor were unemployed. And in terms of political theory, this involved a shift from production to consumption, and also involved a shift in focus from work to everyday life. So those are the debates that were taking place in the 60s around this issue. And more recently, they've moved on and coalesced around a number of key points. One of which is definition, trying to conceptualise what is meant by community organisation, community unionism. In some ways, this, has been a debate which actually I don't think has really taken us very far, because it can be defined in all sorts of ways, and there hasn't really been a way of concretely pinning down what a community union is, which is why I think I'd prefer to talk in terms of community organising, which is much more easily definable. The other points of discussion around the types of community union engagement and whether or not it's just another form of social movement unionism. So we have social movement unionism, within that maybe community unionism, and different types of social movement unionism falling underneath that overall umbrella. There's been lots of debate around the different factors influencing union engagement in community organising, and the different models and approaches, whether that's ad hoc instrumentalism, unions just getting involved when it's something for their own interest on an ad hoc basis, whether it's part of a social supportive coalition, whether it's about mutual support, or as Amanda Tattersall would say, it's around deep coalition building. And also some of the stuff that I've written around about the tensions and constraints on unions working outside the industrial arena. And of course the debates that are starting to arise around the role of new actors in the employment relationship. But the main points of agreement, I think, in all of this, what's happening today, is that the changing geographies of employment, which means that it's much harder for unions to organise than it was in the past. The deep economic crisis which we've been experiencing, and the deep devastating impact on people's lives and workers, and unemployment. The inability of unions to motivate their members to act. All these things are leading to a realisation that unions need to broaden their scope of activity, and that they can't do that on their own. So in terms of the UK, we've seen unions in the UK dipping their toes into community organising, thinking this is a way of going forward. So we've seen it in the TUC doing that through their Active Unions, Active Communities project, Unison with London Citizens and some of the Citizens UK organisations outside the London region. The TSSA, for example, creating a community organising team in 2011, forming groups of coalitions with travelling public and passenger groups, lots of high profile stuff matched with a political strategy to get Labour Party to reconsider the nationalisation of railways. Unfortunately, all that fell apart with internal strife within the union. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that we have seen unions starting to shift in this direction. And of course, we've seen Unite's community membership as well, which has now recruited 7,000 members, and there's 70 Unite community groups around the country. So we are seeing things happen, and for my observation of unions over the last few years, there's been a significant, although not yet well-developed, turn towards community unionisms. As I said, the main factors are the global economic crisis has been a key push to unions thinking that they need to do something new. I haven't really got time to talk in detail about the international case studies. You've got some of that material to read, but I suppose just to draw a few points from what I've learned from that experience. Unions in the US and in Australia are in much more dire straits than they are in the UK. Union densities in the teens in both of those countries, as opposed to 26% here in the UK, although we are heading in a similar direction. But I think it's focused minds more strongly to think about the extent to which fundamental change is needed within unions, and changing completely the culture of unions from being service-based organisations to ones which are much more embedded within the community. And I think for the unions in Australia, the Your Rights at Work campaign, which was very important, community-based organising campaign, national organising campaign, had a significant impact on unions thinking about working with others outside the employment relationship. But overall, I think what I've learned from the research that I've done is that it really does mean questioning traditional tactics and union strategies and different ways of organising, but in a much more fundamental way that's occurred up today, and how unions have to adapt to working with new actors who are playing a role within the employment relationship, and realising that those relationships have to be developed over long periods. It's not something that you can do on an ad hoc basis. There needs to be real in-depth coalition building where there's greater understanding of the different needs and approaches and different cultures within those organisations. But also that industrial relations really needs to give much greater thought to the neglected spaces of social reproduction and consumption and the wider communities in which workers live their lives. And my colleague, Jane McAlevey, who's a long-time community organiser and now an academic, takes the approach that we really need to be thinking in terms of whole worker organising. And what she means by this is the need to understand and harness the power of worker relationships before, during and after work. So all these things are important in the sense that takes it back to what I was talking to you about class not being the primary issue around which to organise. It has to encompass the intersections of race, class, gender, ethnicity, and all the oppressions which people feel, and the understanding of how work and a home life intersect in order to try and draw in the broadest and widest group of workers into union activity, so they're seen as real social justice organisations and real social movement, social union movement organisations that are there to protect workers, not just at work, but in society as well. So I'll leave it there. It's a shame I'm not there to answer questions. I would love to be part of the debate and discussion that you're having there today, but I hope I've given you some thoughts there that maybe you can expand your discussion on, and of course you've got other speakers of which you can ask further questions. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to meeting you sometime in the future. Take care. Bye bye.